You never forget the weight of it, that's the first thing. Not just the physical weight, though God knows that was not. MG42 was a brutal piece of machinery, all stamped steel and sharp edges. But the other weight, the one they didn't talk about in training, the weight of knowing you were the linchpin, the belt-fed heartbeat of the entire section. Everyone's lives, my buddies in the foxholes to my left and right, they all depended on this gun and on me not freezing up when the time came. In training, it was all about the mechanics. Change the barrel fast, keep the ammo belt feeding smooth, watch for the bipod digging in. They drilled it into us until it was like breathing. But the veterans, the old guys who'd been in Russia, they had a different kind of training. They'd sidle up to you during a lull, sharing a cigarette maybe, and they wouldn't talk about glory or killing for the fatherland. It was always quieter, more practical. Listen, son, one of them, a guy named Erich with eyes that looked 1,000 years old, told me once. Your job isn't to stack bodies. Your job is to make the dirt in front of those poor bastards dance. You make them keep their heads down so our boys can do their work. You're a tool of area denial, not an assassin. And that phrase stuck with me, area denial. It sounded so clean, so clinical. Out here, there was nothing clean about it. It was mud and fear and the constant, gnawing cold that got into your bones. But that idea, that I wasn't there to personally aim and kill a man, that became a small, hard stone of comfort I could cling to. I remember the first time I saw them. I mean really saw them as men and not just targets. It was in a field somewhere in France, the mist still clinging to the grass like ghosts. We'd been dug in for days, waiting. The silence was the worst part, worse than the shelling. You just hear the wind and the occasional cough from the next hole over, and your mind would play tricks on you. Then someone would whisper, movement, and your whole world would shrink down to the slice of landscape in front of your sights. They were just shapes at first, grey-green smudges moving through the haze. But as they got closer, you could see them as individuals. One guy stumbling over a rut, another stopping to help him up. They had helmets, rifles, just like us. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure they could hear it. My mouth was dry as dust, and my finger felt like a frozen sausage on the trigger. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading, taking a life. I could feel the eyes of my sergeant on me, feel the tension of the other guys in the line, all waiting for the storm to break. Then the order came, sharp and clear, and the world exploded. My world became a deafening, ripping roar, like cloth being torn in half right next to your ears, over and over. The smell hit you instant lithe sharp, bitter tang of cordite, and the hot, metallic scent of the gun itself, burning your nostrils. The empty casing spewed out, clinking and bouncing around my boots, already hot to the touch. And through it all, I felt a hand on my shoulder, my sergeant leaning in, his breath hot in my ear, shouting above the din. High! Aim high, you idiot! Make the ground in front of them dance. Don't waste the ammo on the dirt. And I adjusted, my arms vibrating with the fury of the gun, sending the tracers arcing just over their heads, chewing up the earth a few yards in front of the advancing line. You could see them falter, see them drop to the ground, their advance slowing to a crawl. That's when it clicked. That's when I understood what Erich meant. My job wasn't to hit them. It was to stop them. And that's where the grim calculus comes in, the kind of cold arithmetic you only learn in the mud. We talked about it, us machine gunners, when we were swapping out barrels or cleaning the grit from the action. It was a dark, soldier's logic. A dead soldier, he's just a body. It takes one, maybe two men a minute to drag him back, and then the enemy is down one man. But a wounded soldier is a nightmare for them. He screams, he cries out for his mother, for help. It takes 3, 4, sometimes 5 men to try and get him to safety, all while under fire. He drains their morale, their manpower, their focus. So in a twisted way, by not killing, by suppressing, by forcing them to keep their heads down and maybe, by chance, catching one in the leg or the arm, you were actually being more effective. It was a horrible thing to think about, but war makes you think horrible things just to stay sane. It wasn't about mercy, not really. It was about efficiency. But for me, it became something else. It became my excuse, my loophole. It let me look at those distant figures and not see an enemy to be exterminated, but just men. Boys, most of them like us. Probably just as scared, just as cold, just as desperate to see this whole damn thing end so they could go home. I imagined they had pictures of sweethearts in their pockets, letters from home tucked next to their hearts. I wondered if they thought about us, the faceless machine gunner in the distance, with the same fear we thought of their artillery spotters. There was an unwritten respect in that distance, a strange, silent understanding that we were all just cogs in a terrible machine, doing a job we never asked for. That's what let me sleep at night. Or at least, what allowed me to close my eyes without seeing their faces in the darkness behind my eyelids. It was a small, fragile piece of my humanity that I could protect, like a single match flame in a hurricane. I could tell myself that I was a soldier, yes, I was doing my duty, but I wasn't a murderer, I was a deterrent. My conscience, what was left of it, could wrap itself around that idea and find a few moments of peace, because the ghosts were always there, just waiting in the smoke. After a firefight, when the shooting stopped and that sudden ringing silence fell, it was almost worse than the noise. Your ears would buzz, and in that haze of cordite smoke and dust, you'd see things. You'd see the faces of the men you'd been shooting at, not as soldiers, but as farmers, teachers, mechanics. I'd see my own brother's face superimposed on one of them. I'd wonder if I'd hit anyone if one of those thousands of rounds had found a mark. And the relief, the sheer, gut-wrenching relief when their attack broke and they fell back, it was like a physical weight lifting off your chest, letting you breathe again. You'd look at the guys next to you, and you wouldn't need to say a word. The look in their eyes said it all. We made it through another one. We were still here. And we'd share a cigarette, hands shaking so badly you'd have to steady your buddy's wrist to get the light, and we'd just sit in the dirt, not talking, just being alive. That was the confession I could never, ever put in a letter home. To my mother, I was her brave boy defending the homeland. To my sweetheart, I was a hero. How could I possibly write, "Dearest Elsa, another day has passed"? My greatest accomplishment was that I managed to fire 10,000 rounds, and as far as I know, hit no one. I am very proud of my restraint. They wouldn't understand. They lived in a world where war was black and white, good and evil. Out here, in the grey mud, it was all shades of grey. The real heroes weren't the ones with the highest kill counts. They were the medics who ran into fire to drag a wounded man back, the guys who shared their last bit of bread, the ones who could still crack a stupid joke when the shells were falling. The dark humor was our lifeline. We'd give names to the rats in the trench, bet on which one was the fattest. We joke about the lousy food, calling the ersatz coffee tank drainings and the hard bread cement biscuits. It was the only way to push back against the absurdity, the sheer insanity of our situation. The homesickness was a constant ache, a physical pain right in the center of your chest. You'd dream of the smell of fresh bread from a bakery, the feel of a real bed, the sound of rain on a proper roof instead of dripping into a muddy hole. You trade your soul for a hot shower and a clean pair of socks. And through it all, the gun was my constant companion, my burden, and my salvation. I learned its moods, its quirks. I knew exactly how many seconds I had before a barrel would overheat and start to glow cherry red. I knew the sound it made when the belt was about to run out, a different kind of chatter. I'd run my thumb over the serial number etched into the receiver until I could feel it with my eyes closed. It was a part of me, but I never loved it. I respected its power. I depended on its reliability, but I hated what it represented. It was the reason I was both safe and a target. The enemy hated our machine gunners above all else, and they'd pour everything they had onto our position once we opened up. So you'd fire in short, brutal bursts, then quickly move to another firing port if you could. Staying alive was a dance, and the MG42 was my partner, a deadly one that could step on your toes at any moment. I think about the men on the other side sometimes, even now, all these years later. I wonder if any of them ever realized that the terrifying ripsaw sound of our gun was sometimes aimed to miss. I wonder if any of them clung to a similar thought, a similar small act of defiance against the madness. In the end, we were all just boys who grew up too fast, thrown into a nightmare not of our making. My war wasn't about grand victories or heroic charges. It was about the weight of the gun, the smell of cordite, the taste of fear like copper pennies in my mouth, the sound of my sergeant's voice in my ear, and the sight of tracers arcing high over a field, meant to terrify, not to kill. It was about holding on to one small piece of myself, the part that remembered what it was to be human in a world that was doing its absolute best to make me forget. And in a strange way, that was the hardest fight of all. I handed us a map back at the briefing tent. A crisp, clean thing with neat lines and shaded areas, like something from a school book. It showed a gentle slope, a creek, a tree line. Simple. But the ground out there, the ground we had to cross that night, was nothing like that map. It was a torn-up, God-forsaken mess of shell craters and shattered trees, a landscape the moon showed you just enough of to freeze your blood. Sergeant Miller, a guy who'd been in it since Africa, his face all leather and his eyes just hollow like two burned-out windows in an empty house, he went down the line checking our gear. He didn't say much, just a grunt, a tug on a strap, his hands moving with a grim finality that made my stomach clench. He looked at me, just a kid fresh from basic, and for a second I thought I saw something like pity flash in those tired eyes, and then it was gone. That's when the lump in my throat got so big I could hardly swallow. We'd just eaten a hot stew that tasted like heaven, and all I could think was, is that it? Was that my last meal? The flavor was still on my tongue, and already it felt like a memory from another life. Then the order came, a quiet word, and we moved out, single file, into the darkness that smelled of wet earth and cordite. The silence was the first shock. You think you know quiet, but you don't, not like this. This was a heavy, living silence that pressed in on your ears, a silence you were afraid to break. Every little sound was a betrayal. The crunch of my boot on a piece of gravel sounded like an explosion in my head. I'd freeze, heart hammering against my ribs, sure the whole German army had heard it. The guy behind me, Jenkins, would give me a slight nudge to keep moving. The shadows, Lord, the shadows. The moon was a curse, I tell you. It would slide behind a cloud, and you'd be blind. Then it would come out again, and the world would be full of monsters. A blasted tree stump became a crouching soldier with a rifle. A scuttling rat in the rubble was a kraut sneaking through the wire. I felt a cold sweat soaking through my wool shirt, a clammy chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the sweat of pure fear, and it made the gear on my back feel like ice. I had this constant, crawling urge to look back, to see the safety of our lines, but you didn't do that. Looking back was weakness. It was inviting trouble, so I just stared at the back of the man in front of me, at the vague shape of his helmet, and tried to make my breathing quiet, tried to turn myself into a ghost moving through this dead land. We were about halfway to the objective, a ruined farmhouse that was supposed to be empty, when it happened. There was no warning, just a sudden, sharp crack that ripped the silence to shreds. It wasn't the familiar sound of an M1 Garand. This was sharper, colder, a German rifle. For a split second, everything was frozen, and then the world exploded. Sergeant Miller hissed, "Down, get down," and we hit the dirt, scrambling for whatever cover we could find. I landed hard in a water-filled shell hole, the icy water soaking me to the bone in an instant. Then the machine gun started, that terrifying BRRRP of an MG-42, what we called a Hitler's buzzsaw, and it was tearing up the ground around us, stitching a line of dirt and fire. The order to return fire came, but there were no targets, just muzzle flashes in the darkness ahead, shadows moving in the tree line. We just shot at noise, at movement, at the fear itself. I fired my rifle, the kick against my shoulder a familiar comfort in all that chaos, the smell of burnt cordite sharp in my nose. I was screaming. I think we all were, just raw, meaningless shouts. Jenkins was next to me, his face a mask of terror and rage as he reloaded his bar, the empty clips pinging away. Time lost all meaning. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour. Then a whistle blast, 2 short bursts signal to fall back. We laid down a covering fire, a pathetic attempt to sound like more than we were, and then we were up and running, stumbling back the way we came, expecting a bullet in the back with every step. We crashed back into our own lines, gasping, covered in mud and sweat, our ears ringing. The sentry challenged us, his voice sounding a million miles away, and when Miller gave the password, I just collapsed against the sandbags, my whole body shaking so bad I couldn't stand. And then the shame came. I turned away from the others, my stomach heaving, and I vomited up that last good meal into the mud, retching from a terror so complete it had taken over my whole body. Later that night, after we'd been debriefed in mumbled sentences, I was sitting by a small stove, trying to stop my hands from trembling, staring into the weak flame. Old man Miller came over and sat down beside me. He didn't say anything for a long time, just lit a cigarette and took a deep drag. Then he handed it to me. "Here, kid, you look like you need it more than me." I took it, my fingers still unsteady. He looked at me, and for the first time those hollow eyes seemed to hold a little warmth like embers. "That feeling," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "That fear in your gut, the one that makes you want to piss yourself and cry for your mama all at once. It never goes away. Don't let anyone tell you different. You just learn to move with it. You carry it with you like another piece of gear." And that was it. He got up and walked away. But those words, they stuck with me. They were more valuable than any training manual. And the bond with the guys from that patrol, Jenkins, O'Malley, even the quiet kid from Ohio, whose name I couldn't remember before 8, was different now. It was thicker than blood. We'd seen each other at our most raw, most terrified, most human. We didn't need to talk about it. It was there in a shared look, in the way we passed a canteen. That night, I finally understood. This wasn't about grand strategies or flags on a map. It was about the man next to you. Survival was a crapshoot, a mixture of the little skills they drilled into you, a mountain of sheer dumb luck, and the simple, unbreakable fact that the guy in the foxhole with you was your only lifeline. You fought for him, and he fought for you, and that was the only thing that made any sense in all this madness. You learned to find a dark, cracked kind of humor in it, too. Like when O'Malley said, back in the relative safety of the dugout, "Well, at least we know the Krauts are still in business." And we all laughed, a ragged, shaky laugh that was closer to crying, but it was a laugh nonetheless. You'd look at a photo of your girl back home, her smile frozen in a time before all this, and the homesickness was a physical ache, a hollow space under your ribs that nothing could fill. But you tucked the photo away, you cleaned your rifle again for the 10th time that day, and you listened to the distant thunder of the artillery, a sound that had become as ordinary as a heartbeat, and you just waited for the next order, carrying the fear, moving with it, because the man next to you was doing the exact same thing. They issue you a kit, you see, a whole mountain of gear designed to make you into a proper soldier, a fighting man, but it's all for the soldier, not for the man. The man is the one who has to carry it. That pack, when you first heft it, feels like it's full of stones. A mess tin, an entrenching tool that's colder than death in the winter, ammunition pouches that dig into your ribs, the gas mask canister that's always banging against your thigh. It's all weight, dead weight, and you learn fast. You learn what you can ditch, what you can trade, what you can break down to its smallest possible part to make room for the real essentials, the stuff they don't issue you. The stuff that keeps you from just being a machine. Because out there, in the mud and the waiting, the weight of a thing isn't measured in kilos. It's measured in what it does for your soul. So you make space. You jettison the extra pair of regulation underwear. You cut pages out of the manual you'll never read, all to make a safe little hollow in your tunic pocket, right over your heart, for a photograph. Not just a picture, you understand, but a sacred object. The edges get soft and furry from being handled, the corners dojed, and there's a smudge in the corner from a rainstorm outside Kharkov. But you don't wipe it off because that smudge is part of the story now. You'd run your thumb over the face of your girl, your mutty, your child, until the image felt like it was going to wear right off the paper and onto your skin. That was the real kit, the stuff that reminded you of who you were before and who you were praying to be again. And then there were the tools. Not the Mauser, not the MG-34 that was my special burden, all cold, oily steel and rattling belts. Those were the tools of the job, loud and brutal. I'm talking about the tools of survival. The spoon you carved yourself from a birch branch during the long quiet near Smolensk, whittling it down until it sat perfectly in your palm, a smooth, warm piece of something living in the midst of all that metal and death. That spoon was more valuable than a general's baton when it was your turn to dip into the company kettle, or the extra pair of socks, rolled tight and kept in a waxed bread bag. Dry socks. Let me tell you, a pair of dry socks after a week of marching with feet like wrinkled, frozen corpses, that was a slice of heaven. That was a morale victory greater than taking a hill. We had a saying, the war will be won by the side with the best supply of dry socks. We were only half joking. And coffee. Real coffee, not that ersatz rubbish made from acorns. If a man managed to get a little packet of the real stuff, maybe traded for it with a supply sergeant for a captured Russian watch, he was a king. The smell of that coffee grinding in a metal cup, the rich, dark aroma that cut through the stench of wet wool and damp earth, that was a smell worth fighting for. My pocket knife, just a simple thing my father gave me, was more versatile than any bayonet. It opened tins, it cut splinters, it carved that spoon, it tightened a loose screw on my machine gun's tripod. A bayonet was for killing, my knife was for living, and we shared, we had to. We were a squad, a little family, a tiny traveling economy. A bar of Swiss chocolate from a care package became a treasure to be doled out in precious squares, a taste of a world we'd almost forgotten. Cigarettes were currency. A lucky strike or a camel was worth more than money. You could trade a cigarette for an extra ladle of soup, for a favor, for a few minutes of sentry duty so you could get some shut-eye. The news from home, when the mail finally caught up with us, that was a shared resource too. You'd read your letter aloud, or at least the parts you could share, the parts that weren't too private, too aching. "The apple tree is blooming," your buddy would read, his voice a low murmur in the dugout. And for a moment we weren't in Russia, we were in some sun-drenched orchard in Bavaria, and we could almost smell the blossoms. That was survival. Not just avoiding bullets, but keeping the darkness at bay. That darkness, it was always there, just on the other side of the thin wall we built with these little rituals, the emotional anchors. I must have read my Lena's letter 100 times, maybe 1,000. I had it memorized, every loop of her handwriting, every smudged word where a tear might have fallen. I knew it all. "My dearest Carl, the weather has been fine. Your mother helped me plant the vegetables in the garden. We put in carrots and potatoes, thinking of you when we harvest them." I'd unfold it with dirty, cracked fingers, careful not to tear the creases that were already like scars on the paper. I'd read it by the flickering light of a candle stuck on an upturned helmet, and her words were a shield. And the photograph. Every night before trying to sleep in some filthy hole in the ground, with the sound of artillery a constant grumble in the distance, I'd take it out. It was a silent ritual, like a prayer. I'd look at her face, at the way she smiled just with her eyes, and I'd try to remember the sound of her laugh. It was a desperate thing, trying to hold on to a ghost, but it was all we had. Sometimes it was the only thing that could quiet the scream of the war in your head. And then there was the music. Hans, the fellow who manned the ammunition belt for my gun, he had a harmonica. A cheap little Hohner, but in his hands it was an orchestra. When things got quiet, when the tension was so thick you could taste it, like copper on your tongue, Hans would pull it out. He'd play some old folk song, something from home, and for a few minutes the war would just stop. The cards, too. A worn deck of scat cards, grimy with the dirt of 1,000 dugouts, could build a fortress around us. The slap of the cards on a crate, the sharp, clever insults we'd trade over a bet of a few worthless Reichspfennigs, the laughter-eel laughter, the kind that hurts your belly, it was a temporary wall. Behind that wall, we weren't soldiers, we were just boys playing cards, the same as we did in school. It never lasted long, but while it did, it was everything. For everything that kept you going, there was a weight attached to it, a promise, a debt, the item you promised to bring back. For me, it was a small, smooth stone Lena had given me from the creek behind her house. It was grey with a single white stripe running through it. "A piece of home," she said. "So you remember the ground you're fighting for." I carried that stone in a little leather pouch. It was a tangible proof. It was my promise that I would return, that I would put that stone back in her hand. It was nothing, a pebble, but it held the entire weight of my future, of the life I was fighting to get back to. You'd see other men with their Tokensur saint's medal, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, a child's drawing folded into a tiny square. These weren't just trinkets. They were contracts with God or fate or whatever was out there, a plea bargain. Let me survive, and I will return this. The weight of that promise was heavier than any pack. And then there was the worst weight of all. The weight of what was left behind when a promise was broken. I remember when Friedrich didn't come back from a patrol. He was a big, laughing fellow from Hamburg, always joking, always had a dirty limerick ready. We found his body the next morning, and the lieutenant told us to gather his effects to send home. It fell to me to go through his pockets. It's a terrible intimacy, that. You're invading a man's last privacy. There was his wallet, with a few marks and another photograph of his parents looking stern and proud. There was his own pocket knife. And there was a small, beautifully carved wooden bird, no bigger than my thumb. He'd been working on it for weeks, whittling it in the evenings. He said it was for his little sister's birthday. It was almost finished. Holding that smooth, unfinished bird in my hand, feeling the delicate lines of the wings he would never complete, That was when it hit me. Wasn't just Friedrich lying there in the mud. It was all of him. His jokes, his love for his sister, his skill with a knife, the future he'd planned. It was all contained in these few small objects in my palm. I had to write the letter to his parents. What do you say? Your son died bravely. That's what they want you to write, but it's a lie. He died scared and cold and far from home, and the only thing going back was a handful of things that used to be in his pockets. I sent the bird, unfinished. I thought his sister should have it. That responsibility, that duty to the dead, it sits on you. It's a cold weight that never really goes away. You see, you start with the weight of the army's kit, all that iron and leather, and you think that's the heavy part. But you're wrong. The real weight, the weight that stays with you for 50 years, is the weight of a smooth stone, the weight of a faded photograph, the weight of a wooden bird that never got finished. That's the weight of the life you left behind, and the lives that were left behind forever. We carried the war in our rifles, but we carried our humanity in our pockets. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, even now, I put my hand in my pocket, half expecting to feel that little leather pouch. And for a moment, I'm not an old man sitting in a warm room. I'm a boy in a frozen foxhole, holding on to a piece of home, praying to make the weight of the return journey. You get used to the waiting. That's the first thing you learn. The big pushes, the attacks, they're a blur of noise and terror, but they're short. God, they're blessedly short. It's the hours between the storms that really wear you down, that grind a man into the mud. We called it the quiet, but it was never really quiet. It was just a different kind of noise, the kind that gets inside your head. My name is Klaus, and I was a machine gunner, first with an MG-34, later with the 42, that damned buzzsaw. But this story isn't about the fighting. It's about what happened in the spaces in between, in the strange, fragile world we built for ourselves while we waited for hell to find us again. The day would start, if you could call it a day, with the rhythm of inactivity. Your hands always had to be busy, because if they weren't, your mind would start wandering to places you didn't want it to go. So you cleaned your weapon. Again. You take apart the MG-34, every pin and spring, even though you'd done it the night before and the afternoon before that. The smell of Hop's solvent and gun oil became the smell of safety, of routine. You'd run the patch through the barrel until it came out spotless. You'd de-wipe down the belt links, your fingers moving on their own, a kind of prayer. It was a way to keep the rust off the steel and the fear out of your heart. And you were always looking for a dry spot. A few square feet of ground not soupy with water and mud, maybe a corner of a ruined cellar, a patch of grass under a broken wall. You'd curl up there, your helmet tipped over your eyes, and you'd try to steal 10 minutes of sleep. Not real sleep, not the deep kind, but a shallow, twitching rest where every distant thump or voice would jerk you awake, your heart hammering against your ribs. Then there were the letters. You pull out the paper, soggy from the damp air, and try to write to Muddy, to your girl, to anyone back in the world. You had to say everything without saying anything. You couldn't describe the smell of death that hung over everything or the sound the shells made. You'd write about the food, complain about the rain, ask about the neighbors, describe the beautiful French countryside you were supposedly seeing. You'd fill the page with these hollow, cheerful words, and you'd hope they could read between the lines, that they could feel the love and the fear you couldn't put down on paper, knowing some censor's blue pencil would scratch out anything that mattered anyway. That's how you got through the days, by forging camaraderie in the mud. Your buddies, the 5 or 6 men in your section, they became your whole world. We were from all over, a farmer from Bavaria, a mechanic from Hamburg, a university student from Köln. In that hole in the ground, none of that mattered. We were just scared kids trying to make each other laugh. The jokes were dark, the kind that would horrify anyone back home, but out there they were a lifeline. We'd whisper stories, creating a whole separate reality. Erich, the big Bavarian, he could describe roasting a suckling pig at a village festival, the crackle of the skin, the smell of apples and herbs, until you could actually taste it, your mouth watering despite the stale taste of army bread in your mouth. Franz would talk about the girls on the Reeperbahn in Hamburg, spinning such elaborate, ridiculous tales that we'd all forget where we were for a few minutes, laughing until our stomachs hurt. And we talked about home, but never the future. That was the unspoken rule. You never said, when this is over, we'll go to that beer garden together. That was bad luck, a curse. You only talked about the past. Remember that time in basic training when Schmidt fell asleep on parade? Or tell me again about your mother's potato pancakes. Describe the way the kitchen smells. We built a fortress out of memories, a safe place we could all retreat to. We shared everything: the last cigarette, broken into 6 pieces, a tin of liverwurst from a care package, a dry pair of socks. You learned to read a man's face, to know when he was about to break, and you'd slip him an extra piece of chocolate or just sit with him in silence, your shoulder touching his, a reminder that he wasn't alone. And all the while you listened. The sounds of that temporary peace were a language of their own. At night, you could hear the enemy. Not just the occasional rifle shot, but their voices carried on the wind. You'd hear a man cough, a faint sound of laughter from their lines. It was the strangest thing. For hours they were just targets, faceless shapes in the distance. But hearing them cough, just like you coughed, or talk in low tones, it was a jolt. It reminded you that over there in that other trench was another kid, just as cold, just as scared, just as desperate to go home. It made the whole bloody business feel even more insane. Then there were the birds. Once, after a long silence, a single bird started singing somewhere behind our lines. It was a small, simple sound, but everyone stopped. The man telling a story shut up. The guy cleaning his rifle froze. We all just listened. For a few seconds, it was just that bird, singing its heart out, a tiny, brave piece of the normal world that had somehow survived the shelling. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. But the worst sound of all was the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a lull, but the dead, heavy silence that would sometimes fall. When the artillery from both sides just stopped. When you couldn't hear a single sound from the enemy lines. That was more frightening than the loudest barrage. Because that silence meant something was coming. It meant both sides were holding their breath, coiled like springs, waiting for the whistle or the order to go over the top. Your stomach would clench into a cold knot, and you'd look at your buddies, and you'd see the same dread in their eyes. That was the sound of the clock running out. Because all of it, the routine, the camaraderie, the little moments of peace, it was all a fragile facade. The entire world we built for ourselves could be shattered in an instant. You could be in the middle of a joke, the punchline just about to leave your lips, when the world would explode. The shriek of an incoming shell doesn't care about your story. The ground would heave, dirt and shrapnel would rain down, and the normalcy you had so carefully constructed would vanish like smoke. I remember watching a man, a veteran who'd been through it all, a rock for all of us. We were brewing coffee over a tiny, hidden flame, and he was laughing. Then a single mortar round landed 100 meters away, close enough to shake the ground. Nobody was hurt, but I saw his hands. When he thought no one was looking, he held them out in front of him, and they were shaking uncontrollably. He quickly shoved them into his pockets, but I'd seen it. That was the truth of it. Underneath the bravado and the dark humor, every single one of us was trembling. We were just good at hiding it from each other. We were all clinging to this thin rope of sanity, and we knew it could snap at any moment. And then would come the moment when the waiting was over. The order would be passed down the line in a low whisper. Prepare to advance. Or the enemy barrage would begin, signaling their attack. That was the moment we all took a collective deep breath. The talking stopped. The jokes died. You'd check your weapon one last time, your hands moving by rote. You'd look at the faces of your buddies, and you'd try to memorize them just in case. The fear was still there, a cold stone in your gut, but it was different now. The uncertainty was gone. The storm was here. The strange, terrible peace of the hours between was over, and it was time to go back to the business of killing and trying not to be killed. You'd rise out of the mud, leaving that little world behind, and step back into the madness, hoping against hope that you'd live long enough to build another fragile piece of normalcy in the next lull, in the next few hours between the storms. That was the cycle. That was the war for us. Not the grand maps and strategies, just the waiting, the fearing, and the hoping, over and over again, until you either broke or died, or by some miracle got to go home. You see them coming up the line, and it's like looking at a ghost of yourself from a year ago, 2 years ago, a lifetime ago. Their uniforms are still a proper shade of green, not faded to a dull olive drab by sun and mud and rain. Their faces are clean-shaven, their boots might even have a bit of a shine left, and in their eyes. You see it right away. It's not fear, not yet. It's this witty nervousness, a kind of desperate curiosity mixed with a complete and utter ignorance of what's waiting for them out here beyond the reserve line. They're replacements, fresh over from the States, and your heart sinks a little because you know what's coming. You do the math without even thinking about it. You look at this kid, he can't be more than 18, and you think, statistically, what are his chances? Will he last a week, a month? Will he be one of the lucky ones who catches $1 million wound, something that gets him sent home but doesn't take anything too important? Or will his name just be another one read out at morning roll call, his personal effects sent back to a family in Iowa or Pennsylvania, a letter full of lies about how he died bravely and didn't suffer? You don't even know his name yet, but you feel the weight of him, the weight of all of them. It's a heavy responsibility, this unspoken duty to try and keep them alive, to pass on the little bits of knowledge that someone, maybe a guy who's not here anymore, passed on to you. It's the only inheritance we had out there, this hard-earned wisdom, and you hand it down like a sacred trust. The first thing you learn, the thing no manual ever taught you, is how to dig. Not just a scrape in the dirt, but a real foxhole. You show them how to go down deep, until the top of the hole is at least chest-high. You teach them to carve out a little shelf at the bottom for their feet, so they can stand up and fire without exposing themselves. You make them understand that the earth is your only real friend, your only protection against the steel that's gonna be flying around. I remember one kid, his name was Jimmy, I think. He started digging this shallow little grave, complaining about the blisters on his hands. Got right down in the dirt with him. "You think this is for comfort, son?" I said, my own hands still caked with the mud from my own hole. "You dig like your life depends on it, because it damn well does. A direct hit from an 88 and even this won't save you, but for everything else, this dirt is gonna be the only thing between you and a box ride home." And you teach them the sounds. Outgoing artillery has a different pitch, a kind of rushing sigh as it passes over you, heading for the enemy lines. Incoming has a freight train roar, a tearing sound in the sky that screams this one's for you. You learn to tell the difference in a split second, the time it takes to throw yourself flat or dive into that hole you dug so deep. And the other rule, the one you drill into them until it's a reflex: you eat when you can, you sleep when you can, and you never, ever waste a dry pair of socks. You learn to savor the taste of cold Croatian hash, because the next hot meal might be days away if you're lucky. You learn to sleep in 2-minute increments, curled up in the bottom of a truck or leaning against a tree, because exhaustion is a constant enemy. And your feet are your ticket out of here, one way or another. Trench foot could cripple you as sure as a German bullet, so you show them how to take off their boots, dry their feet with a rag if they have one, and put on those clean, dry socks like they were putting on a suit of armor. It's those small things, the mundane, stupid little things that keep you human, that keep you alive. Then there's the fear. You can't prepare them for the sheer, gut-wrenching terror of a mortar barrage or a machine gun nest opening up on you, but you try to give them tools. I tell them when the world is exploding around you and the noise is so loud you feel it in your teeth, focus on your breathing. Don't try to hold your breath. Take a deep, ragged breath, let it out slow. Count them. 1, 2, 3. It gives your mind something to latch onto, a tiny island of control in a sea of chaos. And the dead, you learn to look away. If you can avoid it, you never look a dead man, friend or foe, right in the face. You see the uniform, you confirm what you need to, but you don't look into their eyes. The emptiness there, the finality of it, that's something that gets inside you and never really leaves. You see enough of those vacant stares, and you start to see them in your own reflection in a puddle. So you look past them. You focus on a task. That's the other thing. During an attack, when the panic is rising in your throat like bile, you pick one small, simple job. It's not about winning the war. It's about feeding this belt of ammo into the machine gun. It's about keeping your rifle clean. It's about watching that tree line for movement and nothing else. You shrink your world down to that one task, because if you think about the big picture, about the miles of enemy territory ahead or the guys dropping around you, your mind will just come apart at the seams. I saw it happen. A guy named Miller on his first patrol just started screaming during a firefight, couldn't stop. We had to drag him back. He wasn't a coward. His mind just broke. It was too much, too fast. So you find that one thing to focus on, and you cling to it like a lifeline. And through it all, there's the dark humor. It's a currency of survival. You joke about things that would make your mother faint. You nickname the German 88 gun the express train to hell. You call a nearby patch of woods the $1 million corner because the real estate was so hot nobody could stay alive there for long. When a shell lands close but doesn't go off, you call it a dud and laugh with a nervous, shaky kind of laughter that's more about relief than anything funny. You tease the new guys, but it's never mean-spirited. It's a way of bringing them into the fold, of saying, "You're one of us now, for however long that lasts." And you get homesick in a way that's a physical ache. You trade your soul for a piece of your mom's apple pie, or to feel the rain on your face without having to worry if it's going to turn your foxhole into a muddy coffin. You hold on to letters from home until the paper is soft as cloth, reading them over and over until you've memorized every word, every loop of the handwriting. You smell the perfume on the stationery, and for a second you're not in this nightmare. You're back on the porch swing with your girl. But then a shell screams overhead and you're back, the scent of cordite and damp wool and death replacing that faint memory of flowers. But there's one lesson, the biggest one, that you never say out loud. It's the final, unspoken truth that hangs in the air between the vets. You can't tell this to the new guys, not straight out, because they wouldn't understand it yet. It's the knowledge that you will see things that will be burned into your brain forever. The way a buddy's face looks when he realizes he's hit. The sound a man makes when he's dying. The sight of a village that's been shelled to rubble, with civilians, old men, women, kids, caught in the middle of our war. Those aren't things you can describe in a letter home. They're yours to carry forever. And you'll do things, too, things you'll never forgive yourself for. In the heat of it, when it's kill or be killed, you do what you have to do. You throw a grenade into a house because you saw a muzzle flash from a window and you don't know who's inside. You fire your rifle at a shadow, and later you find out it was just a kid. You learn that the line between being a man and being a monster is thinner than you ever thought. And sometimes, in the confusion and the terror, you cross it without even knowing. And you have to live with that. The army gives you medals for some of it, but they don't give you absolution. That's a weight you carry alone, long after the guns have fallen silent. We all knew it, every one of us who'd been there for more than a few weeks. We didn't talk about it. We just exchanged a look, a certain tiredness around the eyes, and that was enough. We were all just trying to make it to tomorrow, 1 hour at a time. The grand strategy, the big pushes on the map, that was for the generals. For us, the entire war shrunk down to the few yards of dirt in front of our foxhole and the guys on our left and right. So when the new guy, with his scared eyes and his clean uniform, would finally get quiet and ask, "So, what's the best way to, make it?" You didn't give him a speech. You didn't talk about glory or duty. You just look at him, really look at him, and you'd say the only thing that was absolutely 100% true. Keep your head down, listen to your sergeant, and look out for the man beside you. That's all there is. It sounded simple, almost too simple, but it contained everything. Keeping your head down was about the practicalities of survival. Listening to your sergeant was about trusting the chain of command, the experience of the guy who'd been through it before. But the last part, looking out for the man beside you, that was the heart of it. That was what kept you going when your own courage was gone. You weren't fighting for flag or country in that moment. You were fighting for the guy in the next hole over, the guy who shared his last cigarette with you, the guy who'd drag you back if you got hit. That bond, that weird, fierce love that grows in the mud and the misery, that's the only thing that makes the unbearable bearable. And then you'd clap him on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, and you'd send him off to his position, hoping against hope that some of it would stick, that he'd be one of the ones who made it, so that someday he could be the one telling the story to the next batch of scared kids, passing on the only thing we had left to give.